Hello, everyone. I wanted to give you guys just a brief lecture on Matthew. And the first thing that I'd like us to talk about a little bit is what the basic questions regarding Matthew's gospel. As we looked at Mark, one of the things that we talked about were the who, when, why, where, what about questions regarding the gospel. And so I thought I'd review those here with Matthew very quickly, and then we'll get a little bit into the text. The first thing that I think I would say about Matthew is that it is dependent. If we follow the four-source hypothesis, it does seem to be dependent upon the Gospel of Mark. And then it also has rather large sections related to this saying source named Q, that we believe probably the early missionaries of the church probably memorized. They probably first memorized these set of Jesus's sayings, and then they went out, and then they were eventually written down into a document, a collection of Jesus's sayings. And so Matthew has Mark's gospel, and he follows Mark's gospel basically for the story of Jesus' life, and then he inserts Q material, so saying sources, collections of Jesus' sayings, into the framework that Mark provides, the narrative framework that Mark provides for Jesus' life. And he does that in 5 different places. He creates what we can call 5 different major discourses or 5 different books. And so it's very interesting to see how Matthew takes Mark and a little bit of Q. Now, if we look at that, we see that if Mark was written around 70, Matthew would have had to have been written after Mark, probably into the 80s. If we imagine that it would have taken, say, 10 or 15 years for Mark to be copied and spread to wherever Matthew's community is, possibly in Antioch, so from Rome to Antioch, and to be well enough known and well enough revered that Matthew would use it as a source. I think we can think of Matthew's gospel being written probably in the 80s, right? And that means that Matthew is probably written not by someone who is an eyewitness, but by someone who was following these 2 textual accounts, Mark and Q, and putting them together. Now, the other thing that we see very interestingly in Matthew is that Matthew's gospel is among the most Jewish of the gospels. It really opens and sounds like the Old Testament when you read it, and we'll talk about that. But I think Matthew is geared towards an audience that may have some Jewish roots or Jewish experiences, and I think probably Matthew is competing with a major group that is shot off from the early 1st century group of Pharisees in Palestinian Judaism, and that this group of sort of new group of rabbinic Jews is who Matthew is trying to appeal to in his work. So you have to have had this development of rabbinic Judaism, a development of the group of the Pharisees into the rabbis, and again, historically, that didn't happen until well after the destruction of the Temple of Jerusalem in 70, and probably into the 80s. And then the other thing is Matthew seems to have a little bit more knowledge about the destruction of the Temple in Jerusalem than does Mark. And because of that, one would date Matthew a little bit later. What happened in the temple and the destruction of the temple has become well enough known that Matthew includes that in his portrayal of the destruction when Jesus prophesies its destruction. Where, we don't know. We don't know who wrote it. We don't know where it was written. But if you look at some of the major cities that are close enough to Israel, I think Antioch might be up in Syria, might be a good enough candidate but it could also have been written in Egypt. It could have been written even in Rome. There are Jewish communities, large Jewish communities in Alexandria and in Rome, but we think that there probably was a large enough Jewish community in Antioch and then a large enough Gentile community that seems to be Matthew's audience. To whom was he writing? Well, clearly he seems to be writing both to Gentiles and to groups. And at the heart of this, we have this conflict between Matthew and the emerging rabbinic group in Matthew's vicinity. I like to think of Matthew's church and then the synagogue of the community that Matthew is trying to compete with. And I think Matthew has people in his community who are both going to his church and probably going over to the local synagogue. And in the synagogue, they're hearing that Jesus is probably not, the Messiah, and that they need to maintain a certain sort of rabbinic understanding of the law. And Matthew, in his church, says, yeah, well, I appreciate Judaism and I appreciate your understanding of the law, but really, I think it's really important for us to see that Jesus is the end of the law, the fulfillment. Not end as the conclusion, but end in terms of the fulfillment of the law. In fact, Jesus is the perfect teacher, the most righteous teacher of the law. And in a way, Jesus then becomes, for Matthew, a kind of new Moses, a new giver of the law. And we see two forms of interpretation, two Jewish forms of interpretation that Matthew uses in his gospel. One is Haggadah, and the other is Halakha. And those are sort of Jewish names. Haggadah is a form of Jewish interpretation that takes a story and recasts it in a contemporary way. So it takes an Old Testament story and recasts it in a contemporary way. We see Matthew doing this particularly in the infancy narratives in the beginning of the story. And then Halakha is a form of teaching, a form of better teaching. And I think Matthew's all about that. He's trying to portray Jesus as the perfect rabbi, the perfect teacher. And so when we get into the gospel, we see that's what Matthew is doing. Okay, I just wanted to give you a little bit of this information. I'm going to come back and then talk through a couple passages and show you how Halakha and Haggadah works, okay? So let's just pause it here, or let's just stop the video here. I'll post it, and then I'll make the second video with the passages, okay? Thank you.